Welcome, AnnaLaura Brown, to the Dish with Dina podcast. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Absolutely, of course.
Will you share with our audience, our listeners, our viewers on YouTube, where you kind of started off recognizing that some things were a little bit more curious for you to get involved in as far as your health journey and where you are now? And of course, we'll go into a lot more of the details as our discussion progresses.
I started having, symptoms of some thyroid issues, a lot of fatigue, brain fog, even pain, muscle issues, different things like that, sensitivity to cold and heat, probably around, I would say 2012, 2013 or so. And it was quite complicated for me to actually get a formal diagnosis, which happens a lot with people with autoimmune conditions. Anybody that knows anything about the autoimmune world knows that it's really hard to get a formal diagnosis. There's a lot of different reasons why that is. Partly is the limitations of Western medicine, and part of it's really even, I've discovered from talking to people, some of the clinical challenges around just the current testing that's available. And it's becoming easier, but it has been hard traditionally. And I, originally got laughed at by two doctors when I told them I thought I had thyroid issues. They're like, "Oh, what makes you think that?" And then they just ran your standard thyroid test and they didn't delve in deep enough and run all of your T3, your T4, your antibodies, all that kind of stuff. And it took me longer than it should have, about three doctors, about 5 years. And then in 2018, I finally got my Hashimoto's diagnosis. So that was the beginning of actually understanding what was actually going on with me. But it was only the beginning, because once you've got that diagnosis, then you're like, okay, now what? And so it's been, a journey the last 7 years to really get to the root cause of what's really been causing it, experimenting with a lot of things, whether that's diet, things like I do chiropractic, acupuncture, massage on a pretty regular basis. About 3 years ago, I got my own personal infrared sauna, which has been really helpful, using red light therapy, experimenting with different kinds of supplements, essential oils, all the different things to try to help put me into remission. And I have to say, finally, my most recent test said that my antibodies are starting to go down. So I am definitely starting to head into remission, which is a really good sign. I definitely feel a lot better than I used to. I look back 7 years ago and boy, I felt like I was sick all the time. And I worried, every time I was exposed to something, every time people would even cough or I'd be around anything, I just got sick a lot too. And now I've pretty much, probably would get sick about once a year or so, but it's not anywhere near like what it used to be.
I want to first acknowledge and address just the complexities and the challenges that just being a human is sometimes for some people, but also define for our audience what it means to have an autoimmune condition. We hear this a lot, and some people don't necessarily know what it means. So, can you explain a little bit in
For
lay
sure.
terms?
Yeah. So there technically are probably, I've been told, close to about 100 different autoimmune conditions that are out there. There are probably more like about a dozen that people have heard of. So things like Hashimoto's, Graves, celiac disease, lupus, MS, rheumatoid arthritis. Those would be some of the more common ones that you probably heard of or know somebody that has one. But the very definition is, for one thing, it's at a core an immune system problem, and it's where your immune system is specifically attacking a certain part of your body and causing dysfunction in that specific tissue. So, like with thyroid, whether it's Hashimoto's or Graves, with Hashimoto specifically, it's causing overactive thyroid. With Graves, it's called underactive. With lupus, it's your skin. With celiac disease and Crohn's disease, it's your digestive and your gut. And so, you're having abnormal problems with your immune system attacking that organ. But what people soon learn as they start this journey to really healing from an autoimmune is that it can actually also have other issues with other parts, other different organs and things like that. And it's not isolated to just that one area of your body. But that's the very clinical definition of autoimmune, is some kind of an immune problem that is causing an issue with one or more of your organs.
Not to be corny, but this is like the knee bone is connected to the neck bone in that sense that there's a systemic correspondence or cascade of events that can happen if things are not properly managed or not diagnosed early enough where then you, like you said, you can start seeing things kind of manifest in other parts of our bodies. And I also love that what you were saying too about like the Eastern, and I guess we could call it the Eastern and Western modalities or approaches that we take to our healing. A lot of us in this country, the United States, we're very black and white, like we're either doing something or taking pharmaceuticals, but not really getting to understand the root cause. And especially in conditions like autoimmune, where there could be flare-ups or could be triggers of really recognizing what causes those things. And so, like you were saying before about having the understanding and the knowledge of a defined diagnosis, but then the second part of, okay, now what do I do with that, really allows the person to hopefully take some ownership and responsibility and awareness, but then what are the resources available to them? So I think here is where I love what you are sharing with your journey and how you are putting yourself out there to be the conduit that if anyone else is dealing with this, they have a lot of resources through you. So walk me through what maybe a current, I don't like to say typical because I'm assuming it might not be typical, but what a current week in the life of you might be and the patient population that you deal with most often, what you're seeing most prevalent of them, and if there's any specifics about that too, whether it's demographics or age ranges of people you're working with right now.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. So I don't do a ton of one-on-one at the moment. A lot of what I do is more like the groups, more producing a podcast, producing a blog, trying to help create community for people. And so my podcast is called Autoimmune Rehab, Holistic Healing for Autoimmune, and the subtitle is How I Cured My Autoimmune Disease. And basically, a big chunk of that is interviews with people sharing their story about how they've overcome their autoimmune or how they are overcoming their autoimmune. And I basically created this podcast for me. There was not anything that was out there when I got diagnosed that was like that. So I created the podcast that I wish that I had had to be able to listen to when I first got my diagnosis. So it's, people coming on there sharing their struggles, their challenges, what they've been through, how they've started their healing, all that kind of thing. And I would say I have a June birthday. I'm currently going to be 48. And I would say, so I was 41 when I got my diagnosis. I would say that a lot of my average age, they're probably late 30s up to early 50s is who a lot of the people that I talk to. And there's also been an interesting shift as well, because it used to be that it was mostly only women that would reach out to me and want to share their story and that kind of thing. And I would say I've been doing this podcast almost 3 years now. It'll be 3 years in September. And the first 2 years, I had maybe a total of about 4 men. This last year, I think I've already interviewed about 6 or 7 men and just recorded, as of while we're doing this, about an hour ago, another interview with another man. And so it's like I'm seeing this shift where there's a lot more men getting these autoimmune conditions and they're wanting to come out and share their story. And there's statistically, a lot more women have autoimmune conditions than men. But what I'm finding with the men is that it's almost like they need that sense of community even more. They struggle. It's like we as women think we're struggling, they struggle even more because there's a lot of time this mindset of, oh, you're a man, so you can't have an autoimmune condition. And it's like, well, but I do, And so it's kind of interesting to kind of see that shift, see it evolve. And yeah, I mean, obviously, because of my own experience with Hashimoto's, I attract a lot more people to want to talk to me, ask me questions about thyroid issues, things like that. I've been gluten-free for quite some time, so I have quite a few connections with people that have given up gluten, whether it's because they have something like rheumatoid arthritis or celiac, things like that. That's a lot of who I end up talking to.
You said you're giving a platform to people, but you're also giving a resource or an opening. And I love that too about the men. We had a while back, we had a retreat, a virtual retreat, and one of the people who was presenting there spoke specifically on men's health and how men are more likely to go without a diagnosis or suffer the consequences of having something found out too later in the stages of things before they can either slow down the progression of that particular thing, because there's a stigma around that where we really don't want that to be. So I'm so glad that you're inviting that conversation in. And of course, the more people that hear these words and these stories, then it can empower them as well. So let's talk a little bit too, if you don't mind, about patient advocacy, because one of the things that sometimes we think with autoimmune diseases, oh, we're born with it, or it starts off very, very young. Were you able to think back as to when, like like you mentioned, you started noticing some symptoms. Was there something that pinpointed an environmental factor, a virus, or something that happened that you thought might have catapulted this? Or was it just an anomaly that happened on its own over the course of, say many years of undiscoveredness, where maybe it was something that could have been diagnosed many, many decades before you actually were?
No, I think there's a couple things that triggered it. So for one thing, my mom does not have the autoimmune, so she doesn't have the Hashimoto's or the Graves, but she has been on thyroid medication for quite some time and has thyroid issues. And I believe my grandma, that was her mother, did as well. So there was a little bit of that genetic component of being predisposition to having a little bit of a thyroid challenge. But I think there were a couple of things that triggered it. So they finally, I mean, I don't know if it's nationwide, but at least here in Utah, they finally banned silver fillings in the mouth for cavities. So those are not allowed anymore. And I know most dentists weren't doing them anyway anymore, but if I flash back to, when I got my very first cavities, probably around, I don't know, junior high age maybe or something like that, I had a couple of silver fillings in my mouth. And at the time that I got my Hashimoto's diagnosis, I still had them. And they were starting to cause me problems. And they could tell some of the tests they'd done said that I was getting a little bit of mercury poisoning leaking into me. So more than likely, I had some kind of mercury poisoning. And that combined with, a little bit of an emotional trauma, I got fired from a job 3 years prior to my diagnosis, or 4 years prior to my diagnosis in 2014. That was a job I thought I was going to have that career forever, and it kind of changed things up for me because there's not really a big demand for what I was doing. So I basically had to start over in a brand new career, and it took me a few years to get that back and get my finances back on track. I just kind of somewhat emotionally and financially crashed and burned when that happened. And so, it was just a combination of those things. And, I think I also had some food allergies and food sensitivity issues that had not really been addressed. So I was eating things that were just not good for my overall digestion. And so, you combine all those things and it created that fire that caused that autoimmune. Yeah.
That perfect imperfect storm that ended up happening, resonating with you. So going back to the thing I wanted to mention about patient advocacy or empowering people. So in your case, like you said, you were not necessarily heard, or you might have been even dismissed with some of the concerns you had, and then having to wait so long to be diagnosed. What could you say to people who the questions that they might want to ask or things that they might want to know before they enter into a doctor's office that can make them feel a little bit more empowered in stating their case and getting the diagnosis, or at least the healthcare providers to actually listen to them?
Well, I would say, yeah, it's super challenging. For one thing, don't be afraid to fire a doctor if that's what it takes. If you're in a doctor's office, they're not listening to you, they're not addressing your concerns, fire them and go to another one. I mean, that may sound really harsh, but sometimes that is what you have to do. But there's a lot of things, and actually even a lot of tools that have come out recently, with like AI, for example. So I was actually talking to a lady, and we didn't talk about this on her episode. Her episode's actually not, I haven't published her episode yet, but she was saying how she has been using Chat GPT and AI to be able to come up with different things because you can actually, and I didn't even realize this, but I tried it myself and it worked pretty well. You can even upload your labs to Chat GPT and ask them to analyze your labs. And if you have the paid version, that's the $20 a month 4.0 version, they can even analyze your labs over time and give you feedback and insights into what's on your lab. So you can even go into the doctor's office knowing at least a little bit about what is on there before you go to the doctors and ask them questions and things like that. But I think another thing that also is really helpful is listen to your own intuition and, ask yourself, what do I think is really going on here? And try to just really tune into your body. And I hear this over and over again from a lot of my guests on my podcast is learn to know your intuition and what you are really feeling because the reality is your body knows what's going on and it can help you and you can tune into that. Even get out there. I mean, in today's day and age, a lot of doctors are like, oh my gosh, not another patient who went and Googled their symptoms or whatever. And I'm not necessarily saying that you should Google and actually believe everything you see, but if you are having like some specific key types of symptoms, I feel like one of the advocacy can be is to do a lot of real research on, what kinds of symptoms lead to certain kinds of autoimmune conditions and kind of have a general idea about what's going on. And, I had done enough of that research too, besides with the genetic component, that I was pretty sure it was a thyroid issue. And then it got elevated by the fact that I had an acupuncturist that was telling my thyroid levels were on and off. So when I went to those doctors and tried to explain that to them, now I didn't get bold enough to tell them the acupuncturist told me I had an issue. I probably should have because they were already kind of dismissing it anyway, but I thought that I would just get laughed at over that, but maybe I should have brought it up to say, hey, look, they're measuring Eastern medicine, which one of the pros to that is that they can usually identify things sooner than what Western medicine will identify things, imbalances in the body, that kind of stuff. But if you go in there with some really good information and empower yourself to have a pretty good idea of what kinds of questions to ask and what kinds of things you might have, I feel like that can help you get a diagnosis quicker. You just want to, there's kind of that fine line between not like hitching yourself, if you will, to being like, I know I have this, and at least being educated enough to kind of know what kinds of things you might have. But, don't go so far as to be your own doctor and try to say, hey, I know for sure I have this before you've actually been diagnosed.
From a healthcare provider standpoint, this is something that and also I don't know if I mentioned this to you too, but I also teach. So we bring this up in a lot of the podcast episodes that I teach nutrition sciences and health sciences undergraduate and graduate courses up at one of the local colleges here. And we're really trying to encourage people to get their heads out of just the textbook knowledge that they have, to really listen, to have conversations around what is called like patient-centered discussions, and really acknowledging and believing lived experiences. If somebody's coming to you, especially if you are the type of person that tracks things over time, like I've been keeping track of certain patterns, and then also coming with curiosity. So AnnaLaura, while I totally appreciate you kind of saying, hey, don't be Googling everything and coming up with all this like random stuff, but it's important to be curious. And if you don't have anywhere else to go, that's not the worst place to start. But hopefully, so my point here is any healthcare providers out there, make sure that you are flexible with understanding. And I recognize that not every office visit is going to allow you the luxury of sitting down and having like a 90-minute conversation with your patient, but really being able to address or answer questions that people are at a point where they could be desperate for things. It's not like they're coming to just ask you about fad approaches to something. They're really trying to pinpoint a root cause and a solution to something that they're dealing with. And they could have been living with this for, like you, right? You could have been living with this for so many years without having a real understanding. So the gentle approach and that inclusivity of listening to people's lived experiences and supporting that patient-centered care, I think is something that, all due respect to a lot of people who are kind of like veterans in the healthcare world, allow yourself to grow and learn and be a little bit more current with some of the other resources that are out there and some of the questions that your patients might be bringing to you. So thank you for opening up that conversation to us, AnnaLaura. I appreciate that.
For sure, absolutely. But you're right. I mean,
Yeah.
unfortunately, a lot of regular doctors they just don't have the time. They can't, they don't know. And so that's where, a lot of times you do have to do some kind of involve some sort of functional medicine or naturopath. I was diagnosed by an actual naturopathic doctor that I paid for out of pocket. I did not have insurance coverage on my labs that diagnosed me because that's what it took for me to finally get it is I had to go outside the system and say, look, I know there's an issue, and even if I have to pay for it, I'm going to find out what it is. And, now it's not as big of a deal because when I run thyroid tests, they automatically check for antibodies because they know that I have that history of it. And the insurance does cover it now, but previously they did not because they didn't know I had it. And a lot of times there's this feeling out there that, so what if you have it? We can't really fix it because medications won't fix your antibodies and your autoimmune component. So they just kind of are like, it doesn't matter.
This is also a great point too. In your metabolic or comprehensive lab blood test screening, whatever you call it when you go for your annual physicals, there is a certain amount of stuff that's just always going to be on there. So like AnnaLaura is saying, if you feel like you need a little extra stuff to be tested, have a conversation with your doctors about that and find out if insurance will cover it. Sometimes if you are at risk for something, and we can get all in a whole different conversation about insurance and what's considered like medically necessary through insurance companies. But I think that's a really good important part to understand is even if it's not covered, even if you might have to take an investment or an out-of-pocket cost, at least it gets you a little closer to that answer. And then you can bring that information to whomever else is going to be in your interdisciplinary team, whether it's your specialist or your Eastern modality healing technologies that you're going through to help support all of that. A couple of the things that I was writing down here too, AnnaLaura, about the inflammation stuff, like anti-inflammatory diets comes up a lot in our conversations around food and nutrition, and everybody's very individualized. So let's talk a little bit too about that. Not necessarily restricting things, but things that you've noticed could potentially trigger or not make you feel as good. Are you able then to substitute with other things? Because my concern around people who might not be able to or don't want to eat certain food groups or certain ingredients is you still have to eat, like you still have to have calories in your body. So can you share with us a little bit about what is working for you and where are you finding foods that feel kind of safe and comfortable? And if you do indulge in any case, like, can you share with us a little bit about that too? Or do you have to
For
be kind of
sure.
very
Absolutely.
regimented? Thank
So I
you.
think the biggest thing is realize that for autoimmune, gluten and dairy are going to be, and sugar really are going to be the three biggest triggers. So if you can avoid those three things in the beginning, which newsflash, you can, they're not, it's not as hard as you think. Those three things, they may be in a lot of things, but there really are more and more alternatives coming out, and you really can do it. And the other thing to think about is eat real whole foods, like your fruits, your vegetables, your whole grains, your meats, your real food. If you can go down that road to begin with, you will probably feel a lot healthier than you will now. That doesn't necessarily mean that some of you may not have additional food sensitivities and things, and there might be some other things you might have to give up. But the reality is that too many of us, we just don't even eat real food. And if we start by eating real food, you're going to find that your health's going to improve a lot. Fairly simple, but we make it complicated sometimes.
We definitely do. That brings to mind some of the themes that come up in a lot of these episodes is that whole discussion around immediate gratification or convenience, or just the mere fact that I think by nature, a lot of us just feel like we're always too busy to dot, dot, dot to take care of or prioritize our health. Now, in the case of something like what you're dealing with, small little changes can really affect your overall either frequency or duration of a flare up or however else is going to be the issue that exacerbates if you trip up a little bit. And and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things that I saw on your social media pages was really kind of inviting and introducing some more structure around things. Like you said, there was something on there, I think, with meal planning and just like recognizing any patterns that you notice. Some people might say, "Oh, I just don't have the time to do that," or that's, easier said than done. What are some things that you can talk to about that with, trying to have people be maybe a little bit more committed to and prioritizing things when it comes to their own personal health?
Yeah, so for one thing, you've probably heard the statement before, and I don't know who originally said it. It wasn't me, but if you don't make time for your health now, then you're going to be making time for your sickness later. So the reality is that you have to make time for your health, and we're not talking large amounts of time. I always advocate for people telling people that you can do a autoimmune health or even just even if you don't have autoimmune, just a general health and wellness routine, morning routine, depending on how much time you're spending exercising, things like that. But an hour or less, you can do pretty much in the morning everything you need to do to set yourself up for good success and good health. And what I like to do is spend my weekends going through creating my meal plan. I will do things like batch cook quinoa because I eat quite a bit of quinoa, maybe even batch cook and prepare, like chop up all the vegetables on the weekend that I'm going to eat for my salads, things like that. And get, some foods that make it easier for you to prepare healthy meals. Things like canned salmon that's already cooked and is actually a lot of times more nutritious and even cheaper than buying the food that's frozen or fresh that you then have to cook, or things like your canned and frozen vegetables, which actually are still really nutritious. So, in other words, just do what you can to be able to meal prep a little bit ahead and have things on hand that are still real whole nutritious food, but it doesn't take as much time. Sometimes I think we think real whole food, we think, oh my gosh, I've got to buy only fresh vegetables and fruits, and I've got to buy only fresh meat, and I've got to buy nothing that is absolutely in any kind of can or package, and it's going to take me hours to cook, and I just don't have the time to do that. But the reality is that when I say unprocessed whole food, I don't mean don't buy canned green beans or whatever. I just mean buy food that, the ingredient list is the vegetable and maybe a little water and salt. They're still just as good and makes it a lot easier for you to meal plan and be able to eat ahead of time.
That in itself could be the convenience food for them. We actually had, I think I did a whole podcast episode and some webinars about that as well. Like, how far away are you straying from the actual ingredient then determines the level of processing. So, like you said, if things are picked and flash frozen, they're probably more nutritionally dense than something's been sitting in, in an aisle for quite some time, kind of like depleting the nutrients in there too. So don't be afraid to get some of those things that make it a little bit more convenient. I absolutely love that. Those little pouches or those canned goods or frozen items are very easy. Or if you have the time, like I wrote down the batch cooking is a big one with me as well. Like if I have the time, do some things up front or put things into little containers or, storage bags so you can kind of grab and go or mix and match your meals on days where you maybe don't have as much time to put towards your planning. AnnaLaura, talk us through, you just mentioned physical activity. Talk us through a little bit about how the rest of the pillars of health kind of relate to this as well. Physical activity, fitness, exercise, movement in any shape or form, sleep habits, quality and quantity, and stress management. Can you share with us too, not just in the sense of autoimmune management, but maybe how your thoughts are about that in general?
The biggest thing is we, especially here in America, where we're reliant on our cars, and everything else, or we sit at desks all day long working, we don't move enough and we don't exercise enough. And you go to countries like Europe, and the average person there gets in 2 to 3 times as many steps in a given day as what we do. And even if you go to Europe on vacation, you're probably going to walk substantially more than you do at home, which means that you need to prepare yourself for that. But I tell people you should exercise at all possible at least 20 out of the first 60 minutes that you're out of bed in the morning. And some people laugh at me, say, oh my gosh, you got to be kidding me. But you can build up to that if that's what it takes. If you can only do 5 or 10 in the beginning and build up to it. But I do about 30 minutes of swimming about 3 times a week. And the rest of the time, I do things like stretching exercises, strength training, dance, like a couple different apps and things that I have going on walks, first thing in the morning outside, that kind of stuff. But the reality is that you've got to get out of bed and stretch and move. You just have to. And if you have autoimmune issues or pain, it's even worse. But you just cannot sit all day long and not get out there and move. You just have to do it. And I find that doing it first thing in the morning really gets that blood flow going. It really gets your muscles going, all that kind of stuff. And one thing that I have noticed, and if you really pay close attention to any of you that have a pet, like a cat or a dog, what does your cat or dog do when they first get out of bed in the morning or out of a kennel or whatever? They start stretching. And why is your animal doing it and you aren't? So think about that.
I'm glad that you mentioned the thing about pain or possible mobility limitations or issues around that. There's probably some sort of physical therapy or physical movement that anybody can do, and that's really to help with the oxygenation and the blood flowing and to bring circulation to those areas. So I'm glad that you mentioned that. All right, my other two questions related to that were sleep and stress. So talk to me a little bit about the importance of sleep habits, whether it's quality and quantity, and also the importance of stress management. Because, like you mentioned too, with some of your earlier issues about job related things too, how did that play a role and how does that still play a role with your overall health management?
Stress is a big one. Stress can impact your sleep, of course. It can impact your autoimmune. It can impact your health. It can impact your eating. We get stressed and then we eat pizza and hamburgers and fries and chocolate and all the ice cream and all the things just to help, try to feel our stress. But ultimately, that can, I think, make things worse because you're stressed, so you eat the food you shouldn't have, and then you get stressed because you have health issues or side effects from that food. And it can become this whole vicious cycle of things. And I've even heard them say that emergency rooms are the busiest on Mondays because people are stressed out on Monday more, or they're unhappy, dissatisfied with their job, or they have caused more accidents on Mondays, things like that. So you really want to think about the role that stress is playing in your life, and if it's too excessive, you may have to make some really big moves. And when I say that, I have had at least two, maybe even more than that, podcast guests come on and tell me that they actually had to quit their job and change careers in order to heal their autoimmune condition. So that may sound really extreme, but sometimes if you are that stressed out, you may need to change jobs. You may need to really evaluate any and all aspects of your life because stress literally, and more research is coming out on this, they're literally trying to say that stress can be an actual illness and an actual disease if it's not controlled.
Yes, yes. We've talked about this in our podcast and also me personally. My N equals one, evidence that I'm sharing is stress can be related to things like high blood pressure, gut health issues as well. You could also be more prone to losing focus because you're so, wrapped up in whatever that particular situation is, whether it's a human or a person, place, or thing that is stressing you out. I am one of those people who did have to quit their job, and miraculously, AnnaLaura, my gut health healed as soon as I left that place. I was like, oh, look at that. That was causing the whole time. I was literally sick to my stomach because of the amount of stress that was put on me. What about sleep? How does sleep play a role, or what kind of like sleep routines do you offer guidance on or that you do for yourself?
Yeah, a lot of times, like I say, stress and sleep are connected because if you've got too much stress, it's make it harder to sleep. You're thinking about all the things that you need to do, thinking about all the problems, all that kind of stuff. And aside from any severe medical issue, which, I always tell people, if you're having really big sleep problems, you may need to get evaluated, do an actual sleep study, that kind of thing. But assuming that you've ruled that out, you want to think about what kind of an environment are you creating for sleep? Because too often there's things like too much light. We have electronic computer devices. We've got a cell phone that's still turned on that's right by our bed. We've got other people in the bed with us that are causing issues. We've got pets in the room, pets in the bed. I do actually now a lot of times sleep with my dog, but I have been able to make that work for me and it doesn't disrupt my sleep, but for some people it might. In other words, evaluate your environment and try to start calming yourself down and start trying to prepare for sleep at least an hour before by not watching TV right up until the minute you jump in bed. Try to do more meditation, prayer, if that's your kind of thing. Listen to music to calm you down. Try some journaling. Try drinking maybe like some peppermint or chamomile tea, using some things like lavender essential oil, turning on a diffuser. In other words, just really give yourself kind of that routine and that environment for sleep because your body needs to sleep. You have to sleep to have good health, and your body wants to sleep. So if you are not actually getting that sleep, it's not because your body doesn't need it, and it's certainly not because your body doesn't want it. It's because somehow your environment or something around you is making it so that you can't actually do the sleep. And then to circle back around to the whole diet thing, sometimes some of the foods that you are eating may even be disrupting your sleep, and you may not even realize it, and you may not even have any other symptom. Like you might say, my digestion's good, I have energy, I don't have any other issues, but I can't sleep at night, and it could actually even be your food. And that is something else that a lot of times we just don't even take a look at.
Yeah, to go through and analyze, I do work with a college group as well, a population, but also really anybody who is juggling too many things or has issues around sleep, is that there's a lot of research that even if you think you can function on 4 hours a night, that's going to catch up with you. And that actually puts you more at risk for neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease, dementia, and maybe even Parkinson's too. So really, a lot of times I prioritize the sleep discussion before anything else because, like you said, it's very interrelated. But if something is triggering something else, and that's going to affect the habits, or I should say, the choices that you're making with your food, your ability to get up an hour early to do physical activity. If you're struggling with sleeping, you're going to prioritize sleep and then miss out on exercising or something. So I think getting a handle on that is very important. And as you were saying, the things like the nighttime wind down, the aromatherapy, it was making me feel so so calm. So thank you for sharing that. And anyone who's, watching this, listening to this, literally do a little inventory. Like that's kind of maybe the challenge takeaway from today's conversation is audit a few things in your life, whether it's people, places, or things. What is disrupting? What is causing you some stress and some strife? Where do you think there are times where you can make for yourself to commit and prioritize your own health? Because that is very important. And Laura, you mentioned screens and social media and things. Let's talk a little bit about that too, because a lot of the stuff that you are doing and that I am doing too lives on the internet. How big of a role does social media play for you, and how structured or what kind of plan do you have for yourself in being able to put stuff out there? Are there certain platforms that you like more than others?
I would say less actually, because believe it or not, I have started to realize that it doesn't play the role in helping to grow my audience or helping people find me that I originally thought. I have discovered that email and using more, just the podcasting, the YouTube, the blogging, SEOing it, putting keywords out there, that is more efficient than just all the noise of social media. And, I'm still pretty much on them all, but you will notice if you go back and look that I post a lot less than I used to on a lot of my platforms. And I have gotten rid of a lot of the apps off my phone. And I basically use them primarily just on my desktop computer. That way, I can just log in when I'm ready and, have done some auto posting, but, I find for my audience and things specifically, sounds a little odd, but I use Pinterest a lot because that is, you're able to post there. People find you over time via the algorithm. And, it's people that are coming there and searching. A lot of people will say it's the third most common search engine after Google and YouTube. So it's not really social media per se. As far as actual social media would go, I would say, I use LinkedIn a lot just because that's a really good place for a lot of networking. I mean, I will casually check and post in a lot of other places. I've kind of started to really wind that down. And when it comes to things like your social media and the screen time and that kind of thing, it's another thing related to your sleep and your stress. You want to try to, as much as possible, not be using that for at least an hour before you go to bed. And don't check it in that first hour after you wake up either.
You are validating so many things. 9 to 10 years ago, when I kind of came into this new career, I hit the ground running with a lot of things all at once. And I felt like I got very overwhelmed very quickly. And then as years progressed, AnnaLaura, you might have seen this too. Like, different features were taking place in different things, like good and bad. Like Instagram, I think, is flooded the amount of stuff that I can even keep up with. Whereas now YouTube is starting to integrate some more like social media aspects to make it a little bit more robust. So you can kind of repurpose content in the search engine. And what you said about Pinterest, I hear that all the time. And there's so many people that don't necessarily take advantage of it because it can lead them to different resources, blog posts, and also this email stuff too. Like I'm a huge fan of getting on people's newsletters. I read through things that keep me updated. I think with social media, specifically when it comes to things like Facebook or Instagram, I'm missing out on stuff versus having something delivered into my inbox where I'm like, oh, thank you very much. I have a piece of mail that I can read through. So I really love what you're saying. And as I'm trying to reconfigure and reassess my own path in my own business development and where I see myself going in the future, you're validating some things. I really feel like I'm happy that I've started scaling back as well, like you have in some of the platforms that I used to be so involved in. And now I'm like, no more, my friends. So let's talk a little bit about the future for you, AnnaLaura. Where do you see all of this going?
I see this continuing, the podcast continuing to grow and thrive we'll see, I tell people that I'll continue producing new content as long as I have new ideas, as long as there's new people to be interviewed, and as long as people keep listening, I'll keep doing it. And I'm sure there'll be a time, maybe in a couple years from now, when maybe I'll just kind of start winding down and maybe I'll just post periodically when I have something new to say and let people enjoy and benefit from from the previous archives. But I think biggest direction I'm headed in, is trying to focus with working people a little bit more one-on-one. I don't want to do a ton of it, but I will probably do some of that in the future to be able to help people. But yeah, just continue to make more connections to help people realize that, you can heal autoimmune disorders, you can thrive with them. It doesn't have to be something where you just merely survive or sometimes wonder if you even are going to survive, that you really can live a full life. You can do what you want to do, and your version of that may make it look a little different than some other people's, and you may have to make some modifications, but you can do it.
I absolutely love that. Thank you so much. Were there any go-to resources that you wanted to share in addition to yours? Like, are there safe websites that are specific to the autoimmune community that you feel like they're good places to drive people?
It's a little bit tricky because, there's a lot of things out there. There's a lot of other holistic blogs, things like that, but it's always everybody's journey is always different. So I would say that a couple of things to keep in mind, going to Pinterest can be a really good resource for things like recipes, things like that, especially if you're trying to eliminate certain kinds of foods. You're really struggling with that. Pinterest can be a really good resource, and really even just, going to YouTube and finding cooking videos, or other things where people are on there giving you your advice, that kind of thing. I know there are resources out there where you can research and find who are functional medicine doctors in your area. So, like, if you need to connect with a doctor that you feel like will delve in deeper and help you out more, you can do that.
My final two questions for you, AnnaLaura, my two-part pun intended sort of question is what is on your plate today? As in, what is the next thing that you're working on, and what is the next thing that you are eating?
I would say, as far as the next thing I'm working on, coming up with some different ideas for working with people one-on-one. So that's definitely something I'm working on. Working on trying to revamp my YouTube channel. I've had it a while. I put up, the videos from a lot of my podcast episodes, things like that. As far as what's actually on my plate, well, I'm going to be eating some quinoa tonight, probably with probably some canned tuna and some different vegetables. Actually going to the Apple store to take a class about how to use an Apple Pencil that's right during a lot of my dinner time. So I'm going to be coming home and rushing home and, needing to not have a lot of time cooking around dinner time.
This has been a pleasure getting to know you and learn more about you. And thank you so much for all of your insight and sharing such great resources and information with our audience. Thank you again for being here, AnnaLaura.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me.